They expected a small Sahel nation to collapse quietly. Instead, in less than a year, a cultural signal linking the Caribbean and West African settled political circles that once dismissed Burkina Faso news as background noise. What changes when Ibrahim Traore is no longer framed as an isolated officer, but as a catalyst in a wider psychological shift that reaches far beyond Ibrahim Traore Burkina Faso? The answer is not comfortable. You are about to examine a dimension that rarely appears in surface-level commentary. Not the slogans, not the viral clips, but the structural meaning behind a public show of solidarity. This is not merely about music or symbolism. It is about how narrative alignment can redraw perceptions of legitimacy, dependency, and sovereignty. Stay, and you will see how a single endorsement can amplify economic debates, reshape diplomatic tension, and alter generational confidence. And the story remains a headline stripped of context. You are about to hear a perspective that shifts the center of gravity, not because it is louder, but because it connects threads that are usually kept apart. When cultural influence intersects with political transformation, the impact extends far beyond a single headline in Burkina Faso news. It reaches into questions of sovereignty, narrative control, and economic independence that many prefer to treat separately. If you stay, you will understand how the amplification of Ibrahim Faso is not simply about admiration or controversy. You will see how a public gesture can alter diplomatic calculations, unsettle long-standing assumptions, and challenge inherited hierarchies of power. This is not entertainment. If you leave now, you may reduce the situation to a clash of personalities or a passing wave of online enthusiasm. You might miss the deeper recalibration already unfolding beneath official statements and televised debates. It becomes easy to accept simplified narratives built elsewhere. Understanding this shift means recognizing that Ibrahim Traore is operating within a larger strategic environment, one where culture, economics, and geopolitics intersect in unexpected ways. The first overlooked fact is simple. The reaction was disproportionate. Commentary intensified across multiple outlets that normally treat Ibrahim Traore Burkina Faso as a regional footnote. That acceleration reveals something deeper than celebrity influence. In less than 12 months, Burkina Faso moved from expelling a foreign ambassador to restructuring control over key natural resources. One decision followed another. Each step signaled a deliberate shift away from inherited dependency. The timeline is short, and that brevity is strategic. Here, the anxiety is not about a song, it is about synchronization. For decades, external powers maintained leverage through separation. Political struggles in Africa were framed as security issues. Social struggles in the diaspora were framed as domestic policy debates. The structural connection remained obscured. When Ibrahim Traore's name began circulating within a broader cultural conversation, those compartments thinned. Consider the economic subtext. Gold extraction, uranium supply chains, and agricultural production are not abstract themes. They form the backbone of trade relationships that extend far beyond West Africa. When resource governance shifts, financial expectations shift with it. Markets respond not only to policy but to confidence. The issue escalates because perception influences negotiation power. Once audiences outside the region begin questioning why certain countries react sharply to Burkina Faso news, diplomatic narratives lose some of their automatic authority. The first to feel the impact are information gatekeepers. Analysts who once framed the situation narrowly now face a more interconnected conversation. That shift does not end the debate, it complicates it. And once complexity enters the room, control becomes harder to maintain. In moments of rapid change, people search for orientation. They look for a figure who can interpret events rather than merely react to them. That role has increasingly been associated with Ibrahim Traore, not only as a military officer turned head of state, but as a symbol of generational impatience. He is not presented as a conventional diplomat shaped by decades of conference rooms. Instead, he is framed as part of a younger cohort that grew up with digital access, real-time information, and visible global inequality. That distinction matters. It alters expectations about compromise, pace, and negotiation. One early impact became visible in agricultural policy. After foreign troops were asked to leave, critics predicted immediate instability and food shortages. Yet the narrative quickly shifted toward domestic production campaigns and renewed emphasis on land as a strategic asset. Whether the results are complete or still evolving, the messaging alone recalibrated internal confidence. A second early signal emerged in public discourse. International commentary labeled him in stark terms. Supporters, meanwhile, amplified a different frame: sovereignty, resource control, psychological decolonization. The divergence itself generated momentum. The practical effect was subtle but significant. Regional actors could no longer treat Burkina Faso as merely reactive. It became proactive in shaping its own storyline. From that moment, the situation stopped being local. It began with a decision, then another. What once appeared sequential started to look coordinated. First came the diplomatic rupture. A foreign ambassador was expelled. The message was concise and unmistakable. For decades, such moves were considered unthinkable for a country described as aid-dependent. Yet it happened, and it happened publicly. Next came the rhetoric around resource sovereignty. Gold was no longer framed as a background statistic in Burkina Faso news. It was elevated as a strategic pillar. Statements emphasized control, renegotiation, and domestic benefit. The tone shifted from compliance to assertion. Then came the agricultural offensive. Land, once treated as secondary to mineral wealth, was repositioned as the foundation of autonomy. Youth were encouraged to see farming not as a fallback but as national service. The sequence mattered. Resources, food security. Each layer reinforced the other. Pressure followed quickly. Financial support was questioned. Sanctions were hinted at. Commentators predicted collapse within months. Isolation would produce reversal, yet the reversal did not materialize on schedule. Instead, messaging intensified. Ibrahim Traoré appeared increasingly as a generational figure, rejecting incrementalism. Speeches referenced dignity and self-reliance rather than gradual reform. Reactions multiplied. Regional organizations debated intervention. Neighboring governments issued warnings. International media amplified the instability narrative. Intentionally or not. At the climax, the discourse stopped revolving solely around security. It revolved around legitimacy. Who defines stability? Who defines democracy? Who defines partnership? After the initial surge, the aftershock phase settled in. Economic uncertainty persisted. Diplomatic friction remained, but the psychological barrier had already shifted. A small, landlocked nation had demonstrated a willingness to test structural boundaries. That willingness became the real headline. Numbers changed the tone of a conversation. Emotion can mobilize, but data anchors perception. To understand the scale of this shift, it is necessary to step back and examine measurable indicators rather than rhetoric alone. Begin with the baseline. For decades, Burkina Faso's economy relied heavily on gold exports as a primary source of foreign revenue. Gold has represented roughly 70% of export earnings in recent years. That concentration means any policy change in extraction, taxation, or ownership has immediate macroeconomic consequences. When resource governance becomes a sovereignty issue, it directly affects national income stability. Now consider the tempo. In less than 12 months following the political transition, multiple high-profile agreements were reassessed or renegotiated. A shift that might normally unfold across several years was compressed into a single cycle. Speed magnifies risk. It also magnifies visibility. Rapid policy turnover forces external partners to reassess exposure more quickly than expected. Then examine the human dimension. Burkina Faso's population exceeds 20 million people, with a median age under 18 years. That demographic profile creates pressure and opportunity simultaneously. A youthful majority means heightened sensitivity to unemployment, food security, and national pride. It resonates within a demographic that will live longest with the consequences. Finally, situate this within the regional context. West Africa contains more than 400 million people across interconnected economies. Any disruption in one node, especially involving security cooperation or mineral supply chains, radiates outward. trade agreements, and investor perception. These figures do not prove inevitability, they demonstrate magnitude. The shift is not symbolic, it is structural. Every transformation generates resistance. It would be misleading to suggest unanimous approval. Serious critics present structured arguments, and those arguments deserve careful examination rather than dismissal. The first counterpoint is stability. Opponents argue that abrupt diplomatic ruptures and rapid renegotiations risk isolating the country economically. They contend that security partnerships, even imperfect ones, provide intelligence, logistical capacity, and financial buffers that cannot be instantly replaced. From this perspective, the pace associated with Ibrahim Traore introduces volatility that may deter investors and strain already fragile institutions. This concern is not irrational. Historical examples show that abrupt geopolitical shifts can trigger capital flight and regional tension. However, the rebuttal lies in examining dependency itself. If stability relies on external guardianship indefinitely, then sovereignty remains conditional. The debate becomes whether short-term turbulence is an acceptable cost for long-term autonomy. That calculation is strategic, not emotional. The second counterargument centers on regional cohesion. Critics warn that assertive rhetoric could fracture cooperation within West Africa. They suggest that diplomatic friction with neighbors undermines collective security frameworks. This position carries weight. Regional integration has tangible benefits. Yet the response highlights perception. If regional institutions are viewed domestically as extensions of external influence, their legitimacy erodes. Reform, in that case, becomes part of preserving unity rather than destroying it. When both perspectives are placed side by side, the issue is not simply right versus wrong. It is a question of which risk is more tolerable: prolonged dependency or accelerated uncertainty. The answer depends on values as much as calculations. Everything shifted at that moment. What many interpreted as a symbolic cultural endorsement began to function as a psychological bridge, when solidarity crossed the Atlantic. The conversation was no longer confined to regional security. It entered the realm of identity, memory, and shared economic grievances. That expansion altered the frame. At this midpoint, the fear is not about one policy decision. For centuries, the Atlantic served as separation: geographic, political, psychological. By keeping struggles compartmentalized, external powers could address each in isolation. But when Ibrahim Traore Burkina Faso becomes a reference point within diaspora discourse, the separation weakens. Economic questions in West Africa begin echoing in conversations in New York or Kingston. The effect is subtle yet powerful. Narrative alignment amplifies leverage. When audiences outside the region start questioning why certain governments react sharply to Burkina Faso news, diplomatic narratives lose automatic authority. The tempo changes from defensive explanation to strategic positioning. From this point forward, the issue is no longer confined to one capital. It becomes transnational. From that psychological shift, consequences moved off the page and into daily life. The debate stopped being abstract and began shaping decisions at multiple levels. At the state level, pressure intensified. Authorities faced simultaneous demands: reinforce sovereignty while preserving macroeconomic stability. Diplomatic channels grew more complex. Each public statement required calibration, and regional tension escalated. Too cautious and domestic confidence wavered. Discussions increasingly focused on institutional resilience rather than mere political rhetoric. Businesses felt the tremor differently. Mining firms monitored regulatory signals closely. Investors recalculated exposure as contracts were reviewed and fiscal terms debated. Supply chains adjusted to uncertainty. Even agricultural processors responded to renewed emphasis on domestic production, assessing whether policy shifts would create opportunity or disruption. For ordinary citizens, the impact was more immediate. And security conditions shaped perception. When rhetoric emphasized dignity and self-reliance, it carried emotional weight. But households also measured outcomes in tangible terms: food availability, price stability, access to services. The legitimacy of Ibrahim Traore Burkina Faso narratives depended partly on these lived experiences. Beyond national borders, regional governments watched carefully. Alliances were reconsidered. International actors evaluated whether recalibration was temporary turbulence or a durable repositioning. Even countries geographically distant recognized that shifts in West Africa influenced mineral markets, migration routes, and diplomatic alignments. The ripple effect extended outward, touching institutions and individuals alike. No layer remained untouched. 3 plausible trajectories emerge. The most probable scenario is controlled tension. Diplomatic friction persists, yet full isolation does not materialize. Policy adjustments continue incrementally. Markets adapt rather than withdraw completely. In this path, Ibrahim Traore maintains assertive rhetoric while negotiating selectively behind closed doors. Stability is uneven but sustainable. An optimistic scenario envisions recalibrated partnerships. External actors accept revised terms, prioritizing long-term access over short-term leverage. Domestic reforms strengthen institutional transparency, reinforcing confidence. Agricultural initiatives mature into measurable output gains. Ibrahim Traore Burkina Faso becomes associated not only with defiance, but with structural reform that gradually stabilizes the economy. The worst-case trajectory centers on escalation, or intensified regional confrontation could strain fiscal capacity. Inflation might accelerate. Public patience could thin. Symbolic victories would struggle to offset material pressure. The determining factor is not prediction accuracy. Future outcomes depend on how decisively current choices align rhetoric with sustainable policy. After examining the structural shifts and possible futures, the most relevant question becomes personal. What does this evolving situation mean for you, whether you follow Burkina Faso news closely or encounter it only occasionally? For those who actively track geopolitical developments, the advantage is awareness. Understanding how Ibrahim Traore Burkina Faso intersects with resource politics and narrative power provides early insight into broader regional trends. Separating rhetoric from measurable change and watching indicators rather than headlines. For those indirectly affected through economic or professional channels, the impact may be subtler but still real. Investment patterns and regional stability influence global markets. Even distant observers can feel the ripple through supply chains or policy shifts. Preparation here means staying informed enough to anticipate adjustment rather than react late. For those who feel detached, the risk is complacency. International realignments rarely announce themselves clearly at the beginning. Opportunities to respond may be limited. Regardless of category, awareness reduces vulnerability. Solutions cannot remain rhetorical. If the shift described is structural, the response must be structured as well. The question is no longer whether change is happening, but how it can be guided responsibly. At the leadership level, clarity is essential. Authorities must align sovereignty narratives with transparent fiscal management. Measurable indicators, budget stability, agricultural output growth, and export diversification should be publicly reported. Success must be tracked through data, not declarations. At the institutional and business level, adaptation is key. Companies operating within or alongside Ibrahim Traore Burkina Faso reforms need compliance frameworks that match new regulatory realities. Implementation timelines should be realistic, with quarterly performance reviews to monitor investment stability and supply continuity. At the citizen and community level, participation matters. Public discourse must remain informed rather than polarized. Educational initiatives that clarify economic literacy and resource governance can strengthen long-term resilience. Measurable change here appears in engagement rates, civic participation, and local productivity indicators. If regional cooperation is to endure, dialogue must be sustained. Diplomatic forums should prioritize conflict de-escalation benchmarks within defined time frames. Execution, not aspiration, will determine credibility. At the beginning, the image was simple: a young leader challenging inherited structures. Now the image is layered. The journey has moved from a single diplomatic rupture to a broader examination of sovereignty, perception, and intercontinental connection. Recall the moment when external commentary intensified. Recall how a cultural signal widened the frame. Through each phase, Ibrahim Traore was not merely reacting, he was positioning. Whether one agrees or disagrees with his methods, the arc reveals a deliberate attempt to reshape narrative power as much as policy. From early diplomatic friction to resource debates and generational rhetoric, the path has not been linear. It has been contested, amplified, scrutinized, yet the underlying theme remains consistent. Autonomy defined on local terms. This story is not confined to Burkina Faso news cycles. It reflects a broader question about who writes the script of development and who challenges it. The final weight rests here. Sovereignty without sustainability cannot endure, but dependency without dignity cannot inspire. The balance between the two defines the future. As this discussion closes, it is worth recognizing that interpretation remains open. Each observer will weigh sovereignty, stability, and risk differently. What matters is not uniform agreement, but thoughtful engagement with the full complexity of the situation. If you believe this analysis adds clarity beyond surface headlines, consider sharing it with others who follow geopolitical shifts or Ibrahim Faso developments. Broader awareness strengthens collective understanding. Conversations rooted in evidence rather than reaction create space for more responsible debate. Reflect on this in an era where narratives travel faster than policies. How should societies evaluate leaders who challenge established hierarchies? Where should the line be drawn between necessary disruption and avoidable instability? Your perspective contributes to that dialogue. The conversation does not end here. It evolves with each informed voice that chooses to participate. What makes this moment different from earlier political ruptures in West Africa is not only policy speed, but symbolic layering. Resource renegotiation often occurred quietly, behind closed doors, with limited public framing. The framing itself is part of the strategy. Narrative is no longer secondary to negotiation. When Ibrahim Traore Burkina Faso is discussed internationally, the tone often oscillates between alarm and fascination. That oscillation reveals uncertainty. Established powers prefer predictability. Supply chains, diplomatic posture. It forces recalculation. The psychological dimension matters because markets respond not only to facts, but to expectations. If investors believe that a government is willing to reassert control over extraction or taxation frameworks, they adjust risk premiums immediately. Even before policies fully materialize, anticipation shifts behavior. This is where the diaspora dimension becomes strategically significant. Historically, external engagement with Africa has often flowed in one direction: capital, institutions, and validation moving inward. When public solidarity begins flowing outward from diaspora audiences toward African sovereignty narratives, the direction of symbolic validation changes. That shift unsettles inherited hierarchies. Consider the legacy of Marcus Garvey's early 20th century calls for black economic self-reliance. His influence was not military. It was psychological, yet it triggered profound institutional resistance because it challenged the dependency mindset itself. Similarly, Thomas Sankar's emphasis on dignity and domestic production reshaped internal confidence even under external pressure. The current moment echoes fragments of both legacies, not in identical form, but in structural resonance. When cultural figures amplify political sovereignty themes, the effect multiplies beyond the immediate audience. It is not simply about admiration. Reframing alters negotiation baselines. If a population believes dependency is inevitable, incremental reform feels sufficient. If a population begins to believe autonomy is viable, incrementalism feels inadequate. That is the generational inflection point. Burkina Faso's median age under 18 is not a minor statistic. It means that the majority of the population has grown up in a world of instantaneous information. Watch global commodity prices and follow diplomatic disputes in real time. Information asymmetry narrows. When asymmetry narrows, difference declines. This does not guarantee success. It increases volatility, but volatility can be a precursor to structural renegotiation. Another overlooked dimension is energy. Uranium supply chains linked to the Sahel historically fed European energy infrastructure. Even when volumes fluctuate, the symbolic association persists. When sovereignty rhetoric intersects with
Instrument of
energy dependence,
international
political
cohesion and
sensitivity
peacebuilding.
heightens. Energy security and narrative sovereignty
Understand why we
intersect in
decided to
ways that
embark on a
rarely appear
revolution.
in daily headlines.
Et vous devez
Regional
continuer.
implications have experienced
ça a
parallel
beaucoup de sens pour nous.
shifts. When
Mais
multiple
la-
nodes in a region reassess external
devez
alignment
trouver la forme.
simultaneously, coordination frameworks strain. Pressure
Généralement, ceux
often
qui sont
backfires
victimes de
when
ça, ce sont
framed
les
as
couches les
coercion.
plus
Pour
Adaptation
diviser,
requires
pour
concession.
manipuler la...
Neither
Et
path is
l'adoption également
simple.
de ses
The
propres
international
symboles.
media environment further complicates
Ça fait
matters.
bientôt 10 ans.
Labeling leaders
10
as
ans
destabilizing or
contre le
radical
terrorisme.
simplifies audience digestion, but oversimplification can inadvertently strengthen a domestic solidarity.
Ces
When external
alternatives doivent
criticism
être dans des
appears uniform,
matériaux.
internal audiences sometimes interpret it as confirmation of independence
La
rather
patrie
than
ou la
evidence
mort.
of error. That dynamic is historically recurrent.
Pour voir l'effet
However,
que ça fait.
internal governance remains the
Surtout les
ultimate
gens pour
test.
certaines choses.
Sovereignty rhetoric must translate into
On va y
measured
aller.
institutional performance.
Agnès,
Budget
c'est une révolution de
transparency
mentalité
and
plus
corruption
que nous
enforcement, agricultural yield
Parce qu'il y avait plus
data,
d'espoir.
and
On était en train
security
de s'effondrer.
outcomes will determine whether
Si
symbolic
quelqu'un tombe
capital
pour la
converts
patrie,
into durable
University
legitimacy.
studies.
Without performance, narrative
Vous n'avez pas
fades.
besoin de vous
With
exposer sur les réseaux
performance,
sociaux.
narrative
Les
hardens
membres de vos
into
familles,
precedent.
vos
The
proches,
broader lesson extends
Et la
beyond
question
one nation.
de
In a multipolar
been
world,
changed.
middle and small states experiment more openly
Province,
with alignment
sending a province.
recalibration.
And this is also a
Others
correct.
will retract. The outcome depends on execution quality on economic resilience. For observers outside the region, the temptation is to reduce
Mais comme ça,
events
donc
to
l'Africain n'est pas
ideological
capable
alignment.
de
Yet the
qui
more
n'est pas sans
precise lens
difficulté.
is structural bargaining
Parce que-
power,
Sinon
resource
même pire,
control,
ailleurs on veut
demographic
payer, même on
momentum,
refuse de nous vendre.
digital connectivity, and diaspora
Retirer quelque chose.
amplification
Les autres
combine
forces
into a new
dans ces
negotiating
zones qui sont
posture.
devant qui arrivent le
That
2
posture
et
may
le 3, vous
fluctuate.
décidez
It
de ne
may
pas trapper.
encounter limits, but it represents a departure from passive continuity. Ultimately, the tension surrounding Ibrahim Traoré Faso reflects a deeper global transition from post-colonial dependency models toward contested autonomy frameworks. What is clear is this: the conversation has already shifted. And once a conversation shifts at the structural level, it rarely returns to its previous baseline.